power of design is working with the other, like someone else, and listening to them and interpreting what they might say they want and turning it into a form of reality. And so what I think visual communication or communication design, it's seen as sort of service industry. You're paid to produce the work. So you're not really paid to question the work. Intersubjective, so there's an intersubjective communication taking place. And she was interpreting my words, but she brought her own conception and concept to that, which then took it into some other space, which neither I nor her could have generated on our own.
So
and
it's so, like a common ground between the both of you.
Sort of like a common ground, but say a higher ground. So it's not just a kind of battle of wills, like what I think or what you think. More like, oh, we've reached somewhere else together.
Like building on.
Yeah.
Welcome to Design Darshan. I'm Sampoorna.
And I'm Sia.
And today we're in conversation with Mr. Neil Haslam.
So, sir, would you like to tell us a little about what work you do and how did you initially come about in this field?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm a communication designer and I actually went to university in Tasmania, in Hobart, where I grew up, which is the southernmost state in Australia. And I went to the art school, actually. So it was a Bachelor of Fine Art with a major in graphic design, which was quite usual in that time. And and I completed that degree, and then I did an honours year where I was investigating some concerns that I had about mass communication, and I was trying to work out, I guess you would say, what my practice might be. I was kind of concerned about a lot of what I saw as visual pollution, and I thought that visual communication was incredibly powerful, and yet it was in the hands of people who didn't really care about the impact of their work. You know, they just wanted to sell things. And so I produced a range of work that investigated that idea. And then when I graduated, there was a job that came up, and it was actually in an advertising agency. And then I said, well, why would I want to work in an advertising agency? It's kind of antithetical to what I believe. But then I thought, actually, that would be good because I'd actually learn about this thing. And so I went and worked there for a year and a half, and I learned a lot about how to work, like quickly, and produce work quickly. And I met a lot of great people, and I had a lot of experiences which helped me think about my practice as a designer. One of which was producing a bit of direct mail, which was just about a sort of music festival. But I remember seeing it around the city in a lot of the gutters because it had been distributed, but it ended up like into the gutter. Yeah. And I was thinking, like, what is it to do that sort of work? And then I took a break and I went overseas for a while.
So when you say that visual communicators, they have a certain power, can you elaborate more on what kind of power or how can they communicate their ideas in the correct format for the world?
Well, like often visual communication or communication design, it's seen as a sort of service industry, like you're paid to produce the work. So you're not really paid to question the work. So, and one is trained to produce effective work that's appropriate for the situation. And so, in a sense, that's absolutely apolitical. Like you can work on any product or any system, and when you speak to the client, you get an understanding of their motivations and desires and aspirations, and you produce work that brings that into the world, it brings it into reality. And so, I mean, I believe that that's actually quite a good stance to take. Like I think that designers who feel like they're like artists, you know, what I believe, and I'm going to bring this into the world, is kind of a strange thing, because I think that the power of design is working with the other, like someone else, and listening to them and interpreting what they might say they want and turning it into a form of reality. And so what I think is a really valuable thing for designers to experience is being designed for. And I worked for a long time before that happened to me, and it was actually a student, and I was organising a little mini conference. And I knew what the name was, and I knew when it was going to take place and where and who the speakers were. But until she started asking me questions about it, that allowed me to think it through, what I was trying to achieve. And then she came back with a visual solution. And it was only when she came back with the visual solution that I could say, no, that's not what I really want. And for me to see her do that, because I'd been on the other end of the story so often. And so the way she did that, and then we refined it. And I said, what about something like this? And then she came up with another idea, which was not my idea. But I went, that's interesting. And so together, you imagine the two of us were a little bit like intersubjective. So there's an intersubjective communication taking place. And she was interpreting my words, but she brought her own perception and concept to that, which then took it into some other space, which neither I nor her could have generated on our own.
So you found like a common ground between the both of you.
Sort of like a common ground, but almost I'd say a higher ground, because it's through like you imagine like it's a material conversation, and you imagine when you have a conversation and you both have insight through that conversation. So it's not just a kind of battle of wills, like what I think or what you think. It's more like, we've reached somewhere else together.
Like building on it.
Yeah, and I think
so it's like what you said about designing for, and then it turned into something that you started designing with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nicely put. Yeah.
So how do you differentiate between storytelling as a method versus storytelling as an outcome when you're trying to communicate with people and design with people?
Wow. Yeah, good question. I actually think it can be both, and storytelling, and some people refer to this as narrative inquiry or the use of narrative. Sometimes it's a research methodology in that as designers we can use narrative inquiry to just generate knowledge that otherwise we wouldn't have any access to. And so it's very good for lived experience. So with people who are not academics or not students, you can ask them to tell a story from their past. It brings it to the heart. So they tell, often without much prompting, they'll tell quite a meaningful story, like it might be from their past or whatever. And their minds stop being in a theoretical sort of frame and they start being in a emotional, real world sort of lived framework. So, and lived experience is really valuable now, we find, because we can do quantitative research. We can work out how many people catch the bus, or we can do qualitative research and we can kind of ask them, why do you catch the bus? But if we ask them to tell a story about when they first caught a bus when they were a child, and they talk about getting on board the bus with their mother and how exciting it was, it gives us a very rich experience, and we get insight into that. And so it takes design into the sort of empathy-driven way of really understanding interaction. And so I think, like going back to your original question, I think it is both an outcome and a process. I mean, it does produce outcome, which can be kind of like an indicator. So when you're doing work with people and bringing participants in, you can use those stories to actually represent, there were people like this, and you could use those stories to represent there's this group and there's this group and there's this group. but you can also use it to just understand a situation much more deeply. So it both is a representation, but also it is an artifact, a presentation.
So you used a really powerful term called the lived experiences, and you mentioned a project that you were working on, Tram Yatra. How do you think that the aspect of storytelling and lived experiences comes into conversation with something like mobility of Tram Yatra to create the effects that you want to do from that project?
Yeah. No, so with Tram Yatra, and we use like the I don't know why, but we do. But obviously it can also be the Tram Yatra, and it's a play on words, so it's got the whole idea of the journey as well as being a vehicle, and you know. But with Tram Yatra, which has been going on for some time, storytelling, it really allows us to engage with our audiences. So we sort of bring them into the project. Initially, they're quite engaged by it, so it is very public facing. But by gathering people's stories, and we have different methodologies, Sangeet Sankar, who I'm working with, has used storytelling through narrative prompts and asking people to create a story out of prompt cards. We also did a project. I did a project there with Rob Eales, who's a Melbourne designer, where we played with very old letterpress type, which is movable type. And so we asked people to give us 3 words based on a prompt. Like one of them was, what 3 gifts would you bring to the wedding of Kolkata and the Sundarban? And so the project was about Kolkata and the Sundarban and sustainable transport and nature and culture. And so then they had to think, what 3 things or what 3 words? So it's very short. It's a mini story, and it's just like dum, dum, dum. And so people were choosing words like resilience. There was one young woman, and she chose the word mama and tiger and Sundarban. And I thought just a connection between those 3 in the sense of the, I think it was the maternal, you know, and the maternal and the sense of the Sundarban. And this is me absolutely interpreting her story, but that's kind of okay. Like, she has a reason why she uses those words, but it's like a poem. We're free to interpret it. But this sense of the maternal running through the more than human species, and then this vast, biggest mangrove wetland in the world is really powerful, I think, and it's only 3 words. And so in that, the narrative is inspiring us as, you know, project instigators, like we started the project, but it takes our thinking further. And a little bit like the first story I told about the designer working for me, like we go somewhere different together. And I think that's a design act.
Yeah,
and I think it's kind of an opening up of the future, you know, that we do as designers. Is we've got tools that allow us to, and I don't mean like, I'm going to design a new Tesla. I mean, we can quite gently move into different, whether you call them alternative presents or whether you call them futures, but we can move into them together in quite a delicate fashion. And I think that's really exciting, because you're moving from a place of the known to a place that is not known, and yet it reveals what you don't know you know. And so then you have this collective knowledge, and it's a revealing.
Right.
And so the more I've studied design, the more interested I am in that sense of that as a revealing, that it's an unconcealing. It is something that's already in it. It's kind of in existence, but it's not yet brought into the world.
So you can always dig deeper into
Yeah.
So when you mentioned, so like something as simple as just three words has a lot of cultural significance to it, right? So here with Tram Yatra, how do you think it can influence the public's perspectives or say the policies regarding environmental crisis out here?
Well, I think it can. I was just talking to Sangeet about this, but are we going to save the trams? I don't know. Probably not. Like the West Bengal government seems very inclined to dismantle the tram system, and generally on the street, people feel like the trams are causing bad traffic, that they're responsible for the traffic congestion. And so there's quite a negative feeling towards the trams, and that they're old and clunky and they represent the past. However, I don't know, we had a lot of good feedback. People in Kolkata are actually very proud of their heritage. So I think that's a little bit of a way in to heritage. I think that, there might well be possibility of change. I think we can. We created a space with the hub. We used a tram depot. We used design to create a sort of platform, like literally a platform off the ground where people were speaking and singing and doing activities.
Right.
And we created a sort of, in a way, like a different environment which allowed, I hope, it allows people to sort of think differently and conceptualise different ways of being and ways of living and different ways that the city might be. So I hope that it kind of liberates us from habituated thinking and allows us to think about other possibilities. And then on the fourth day, we had a public sort of lecture with panel discussion, and that was a collection of sort of notable experts in their area, whether it was botany or there was a transport person. There was a woman who was a scientist around mangroves. There was someone who was very interested in the history of cities, and he had a sense that the city was a body, and if we think about the city as a body and the morphology of the body, and so it can allow different ways of thinking about what our mega cities can be like. And so I think that sort of public discussion, and then it gets reported in the papers and people get quite interested in it, that's sort of one step away from policy change, like it actually can have real impact. But I think if you step back from there to the one, like say the person who's like Mama, Tiger and Shundaban, even for her, that's sort of like a moment where her voice is heard and recorded and sort of celebrated. And so that's quite interesting in terms of participatory democracy, and it changes the nature of, unlike being, say, a consumer of media, she's put in a position where, oh, well, what do you think, as an individual? So I think even though we probably won't save the trams and there's a big economic push for to build, tall housing development blocks, and there's a lot of money to be made in that, and people don't see the trams as an economic proposition. Nonetheless, I think that there were various moments and different scales where we did have impact through the project, and will continue to. So,
surely.
Yeah.
So, keeping in mind storytelling is a big part of this. Do you think storytelling can reach a mainstream in the future of design industry to help out with all of these problems?
Oh yeah, I think they're already using it. Yeah, absolutely. In my sense of working with industry advisory bodies. And it's being used, it's also being used to sell chocolate bars, and it's being used for other things. It's definitely being used in my hometown in Melbourne to think about the future of the city and to think about different people's experiences of the city and the diversity within the city. Where definitely at the moment it's very interesting to not think of the city as, in the past there was sort of like, oh, it's this one type of city, but more to think of it as a sort of plurality of cities that for different people it's different things. And yeah, I think that's really interesting, you know, if it can be like Melbourne is on the point of maybe being quite cosmopolitan. That's my hope, and that it and that its cosmopolitanism is quite can be quite rich. And we actually know through research that diversity is generative and creative, and also kind of healthy, like literally mental health, and you know, and so if we can foster that sort of community, then that's a good thing. And so yeah, I think it's being used to bring stories to the fore, which are other people's lived experience, and so one can get a little bit of insight into these different ways of living and being, and that is both validating for me, but it's also validating for the other. Yeah.
So it's already a big part of design, as you say. Okay. So knowing that you're from Australia, so how do you think has your design context or practices changed having come to Kolkata or having worked in Kolkata?
Oh yeah. Well, it did. I mean, I first went to Kolkata in 2005 because I've been part of the project for some time, and when I did that, I designed a book because the project had been going on for a while, and then and we decided to make a book, and I designed this book, and I hadn't been to Kolkata, and initially we got half of it printed in Melbourne and half printed in Kolkata. It didn't really work, so we ended up, but we had a book launch in Kolkata, but when I was in Kolkata, I mean, you know, it's a very rich city, a very rich, vibrant city. But I looked at the Swiss grid. I'd sort of had like a bit of a Swiss grid, like typographically, that sense of universal order and consistency. And I thought, how does this work with this? You know, like, so it kind of disturbed some of my design principles in an interesting way, in a really useful way.
It gave you a different outlook.
Oh, really different outlook. And then this trip, which was just the last week, I mean, I'm yet to sort of fully process. There was a lot that happened. Primarily, I mean, I think there's a lot of real, I don't know what it is, like human kind of knowledge or wisdom, kind of, I don't know. It's very human city, very lively.
Connections and stuff.
Yeah, so much so. Incredibly beautiful. And so, I don't know. I mean, I actually thought, wow, like a lot of people I know who are kind of like hipstery Melbourne types would love Kolkata if they'd been there. Yeah, they'd like it.
Okay. So just to close off this episode, as students of design, we'd like to ask you if you have any recommendations for any books, shows, or any creative pieces of work that you think are a must watch or a must read for us.
I think you should read. I think it's really valuable. A lot of students don't read. I've got a student at home in Australia, and she was really funny because she saw me doing video conferencing, and back home I've got an office at home, and in my office I've got a bookshelf, and I had to take all my books from university back home because I moved into an open plan situation. And so I've got like a whole lot of books. And so she saw me on a video conference, and she sees me with all these books behind me. And she said, Neil, do I have to read to do design? I don't like reading. I said, oh, that's a shame. She said, I don't mind watching videos like YouTube. I don't like reading. And I thought it was funny. But, I don't know. I think books, do contain knowledge in a different form. So, some of the titles that have been important to me, there's one book which is by Donald Schön, who was a sort of theorist and design theorist, which is around reflective practice. I think it's called The Reflective Practitioner.
Okay.
And so it's a bit of a primer in reflective practice. And he talks about when we make a design move, he calls it a conversation with the materials of the situation. And so we make a move and then we observe what that move does. And so it's about a dialogic approach to design. And he also talks about this idea of pushback, or back talk. He calls it back talk, that the thing we design talks back to us.
Okay.
So, and I think that's a really important thing to learn. And he helped me to kind of go, oh yeah, that's a good articulation of that. And we need to listen, but when we do design, the thing we've conceptualised and that we think, oh, this will be brilliant, and we make it, and then it becomes material, but it actually pushes back against our perceptions.
I never thought about it like that. Any design, like I do see it now. I do understand what you're trying to say when you say that they, your own pieces do talk back to you. You try to understand what you have made or gained out of it.
Yeah. And he was interviewing and working with a lot of architecture, but I think it applies to any form of design practice.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, but you need to be able to listen to that.
Right.
Yeah. That's why I think for students or anybody really, it's good to design things early, like iteratively, prototype, because then you can take advantage of that in that sense. And it's kind of like the wisdom of and it doesn't have to be a material artifact, it might be a digital artifact, but that sense of getting it outside of yourself so you can see it and it can speak back to you. So I would highly recommend that.
Sure. Thank you so much for taking our time for us today. I'm sure this has been a great conversation for everyone who's going to view it. Thank you so much for watching Design Darshan.